The sea lay calm under a pale morning. Sky east of Iwo Jima. Waves lapped quietly against the dark, steel hull of the USS Missouri, the newest and most formidable battleship in the U.S. Navy. On her decks, men stood silent, waiting. The scent of salt and oil filled the air. Then from the bridge, the final order echoed, "Commence firing!" If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like it, spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from. A deep mechanical hum rose from the turrets. The ship shuddered. In an instant, the calm was shattered by thunder. 3 16-inch Mark 7 guns erupted in blinding flashes, hurling 2,700-pound shells into the horizon. The sound was unlike anything heard before, an unearthly roar rolling across the Pacific. The recoil drove through the decks like a living force. Moments later, distant fireballs bloomed on Iwo Jima's volcanic ridges. Japanese bunkers vanished beneath earth and flame. The Missouri's gunners stood awed by their own power. The ship had finally spoken. And the war had heard her. That day marked not just her baptism of fire, but the beginning of a new chapter in naval warfare, one forged in steel, smoke, and unrelenting precision. Now, the world would witness what American battleship power truly meant. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most punishing phase. Nearly 4 years had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the once unstoppable Japanese Empire was now cornered within the vast expanse it had conquered. The U.S. Navy, having fought island by island across the Central Pacific, was now tightening its grip on Japan's final defenses, the home islands themselves. Every mile of ocean was now a battlefield, and every island fortress a desperate last stand. The strategy that had brought the Allies here was simple but brutal: island hopping. From Tarawa to the Marshalls, from the Marianas to the Philippines, American forces bypassed heavily fortified Japanese positions, seizing key islands to build airfields and naval bases. Each victory brought U.S. bombers and warships closer to Japan's shores. But it came at a staggering cost. Every landing meant blood, fire, and tenacity against an enemy that refused to surrender. By 1945, the Pacific Fleet was no longer a defensive force. It was an unstoppable machine of war. Carriers ruled the skies, submarines strangled Japanese shipping, and an armada of new-generation warships patrolled the sea. Among these giants were the Iowa-class battleships, the fastest and most powerful ever built by the United States. The Iowa-class represented the pinnacle of battleship evolution, designed to combine overwhelming firepower with unmatched speed. In modern 87 feet long, with a displacement exceeding 57,000 tons when fully loaded, these warships could sprint at more than 33 knots. They were floating fortresses, bristling with 9 16-inch guns capable of striking targets over 20 miles away. Each shell, 2,700 pounds of hardened steel and explosive power, could obliterate concrete bunkers or pierce the armor of any enemy ship afloat. When Missouri, BB-63, was commissioned in June 1944, she was the third of her class, following Iowa and New Jersey. Yet she arrived in a world where the role of the battleship was changing. Aircraft carriers had become the new rulers of naval combat, projecting power far beyond the horizon. But the battleship was far from obsolete. Her massive guns were now the Navy's blunt instrument for supporting amphibious assaults, pounding beaches and fortifications. Before the Marines went ashore, Missouri was thus born not into the age of ship-to-ship duels, but into the brutal age of shore bombardment and total war. Her arrival came at the height of American dominance and Japanese desperation. The Empire's navy was shattered, its merchant fleet crippled, and its cities under constant attack from B-29 bombers. Yet its island garrisons fought on with fanatic determination. This was the environment awaiting the Missouri, a world where the last act of the Pacific War would be written in fire and steel. The ship's sleek hull and modern fire control systems represented America's industrial might at its zenith, while her guns symbolized the raw, unforgiving power that would break Japan's last defenses. As the Pacific closed in around the Japanese homeland, the Navy prepared for its next great assault, Iwo Jima. The volcanic island, barely 8 square miles in size, would become the stage where Missouri would first unleash her thunder. But before that day of fury, the ship would have to prove herself worthy of joining the fleet that would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. And so, before her first battle, came her baptism in preparation, her trials, her training, and her journey to war. The USS Missouri began her life of war in the calm waters of the Chesapeake Bay. After her commissioning on June 11, 1944, she embarked on a shakedown cruise, a rigorous test of every system, every gun, and every crewman. For weeks, she drilled relentlessly, gunnery exercises, damage control, and high-speed maneuvers. Her crew, drawn from across America, learned to operate one of the most complex war machines ever built. The 2,700-pound shells they handled were taller than a man, each one a weapon of immense potential energy. From the bridge, Captain William M. Callahan oversaw the process of turning a new ship into a weapon of war. He was a calm, methodical leader, a naval officer who understood both the ship's power and the discipline required to control it. Under his command, the Missouri became a living organism, each man a vital part of its operation. By November 1944, after completing her training in the Caribbean, Missouri steamed through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific. Her arrival at Pearl Harbor carried symbolic weight. Just 3 years earlier, Japanese bombs had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet here. Now, from the same waters, the Navy's mightiest battleship prepared to avenge that day. Her destination, the Western Pacific. Her assignment, Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet. Halsey's fleet was the spear point of the U.S. Navy's advance toward Japan. It was a mobile juggernaut built around fast carriers and their powerful escorts. Battleships like Missouri served as both protectors and heavy artillery, ready to crush enemy positions or defend the fleet from attack. For Missouri, this meant joining the fight at a critical juncture, the push toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japan's last major outposts before the home islands. In January 1945, the battleship joined Task Force 58, part of Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, as part of the preparatory bombardments leading up to the invasion of Iwo Jima. These operations required precision, coordination, and overwhelming force. The Missouri's 16-inch guns were designed for exactly this purpose: to soften up defenses, destroy artillery, and silence enemy batteries before Marines set foot on hostile beaches. The crew's anticipation grew with each passing day. They had trained endlessly for this moment. The gunners fine-tuned their elevation and range calculations. Radar operators adjusted targeting systems capable of pinpoint accuracy. Each sailor knew that soon, their ship's name would no longer be just a word painted on steel. It would echo across the Pacific as a symbol of American power. By mid-February 1945, the stage was set. The U.S. Navy's armada, hundreds of ships strong, assembled around Iwo Jima. Overhead, carrier aircraft struck the island's volcanic ridges, while submarines patrolled the waters below. The air reeked of oil, cordite, and tension. Then came the signal. The Missouri was ordered to open fire. In that instant, the months of training, the precision of design, and the might of American industry converged into a single act of destruction. The thunder that followed was not just a sound. It was history being written at the edge of the world. When the USS Missouri prepared to fire her first combat salvo in February 1945, she represented far more than just another warship. She was the distilled product of decades of naval engineering, strategic evolution, and human endurance, a fusion of science and sweat designed for one purpose: to deliver absolute power with precision. At the heart of the Missouri's dominance were her 9 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 naval rifles, each a machine of terrifying potential. They were the largest guns ever mounted on an American battleship, stretching over 66 feet in length and weighing nearly 120 tons apiece. Capable of launching a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell over 23 miles, they were both brutal and refined, as much a testament to industrial genius as to destructive necessity. The ship's fire control systems were equally groundbreaking. High atop the superstructure sat radar-directed rangefinders capable of tracking targets day or night, through fog, rain, or smoke. Analog computers deep within the ship translated bearing, wind, and roll into firing solutions accurate to the yard. Every shell was calculated, not guessed. The Missouri's gunners, many barely in their 20s, operated machinery so precise it could drop shells onto a target invisible to the naked eye. The power of the Mark 7 was staggering. When a gun fired, it released energy equivalent to a small earthquake. The shockwave rippled through the decks, rattling bulkheads and echoing down steel corridors. Even those below in the engine rooms could feel the vibration in their bones. Yet the guns themselves were so well balanced that they could fire again within seconds, maintaining a relentless rhythm that few enemies could withstand. Each turret was a fortress unto itself, manned by nearly 100 sailors working in unison. Powder bags, each weighing 90 pounds, were hoisted up mechanically and rammed behind the shell. Doors slammed shut. A final confirmation echoed through the headset. Then, fire. The engineering was matched by sheer logistical might. Each full salvo consumed 9 shells and 36 powder bags. Over 2 tons of ammunition in a heartbeat. Below decks, elevators hummed non-stop to feed the guns. Every movement was rehearsed, every second timed, because even a single error in loading those massive weapons could mean disaster. The result was the most precise, the most devastating bombardment weapon of the Second World War. But technology alone didn't win wars. It was the way that technology was used. By 1945, the US Navy had mastered a new art, coordinated naval bombardment. The days of blind shelling were gone. Instead, ships like the Missouri fired under the careful direction of spotter aircraft. Tiny float planes launched from the ship's catapults that circled high above the battlefield. These scouts relayed real-time corrections back to the fire control teams aboard. The result was extraordinary precision. Shells landed within yards of designated targets, tearing apart bunkers, caves, and command posts. This was the new face of battleship warfare. Less about duels with enemy fleets, more about supporting troops ashore. At Iwo Jima, the terrain itself was the enemy. Volcanic rock, riddled with tunnels, defended by thousands of entrenched Japanese soldiers. The Missouri's guns were tasked with breaking open that fortress before the Marines landed. Every salvo was calculated for maximum effect. High explosive shells churned up the black sands and pulverized gun positions. The 16-inch rounds carved craters large enough to swallow trucks. For days before the invasion, the Missouri and her sister ships turned the island into a living inferno. Yet despite the devastating bombardment, the Japanese survived underground, proof of the limits even of such overwhelming firepower. Still, the tactical lessons were clear. Naval gunfire, when coordinated with air and ground forces, was a weapon of unprecedented reach. The Navy learned how to synchronize strikes, to shift targets instantly, to use radar to hit what the eye could not see. The Missouri was both instrument and laboratory in this new way of war. But while tacticians calculated angles and engineers refined systems, the human cost, the beating heart of the ship, remained. Life aboard the Missouri was a mixture of monotony, tension, and ritual. The ship was a floating city of nearly 2,800 men, an organized chaos of metal and movement. Days were structured around drills, fire drills, gunnery drills, damage control drills. Even the simple act of sleeping was done in rhythm, with the thrum of the engines and the scent of oil. Before battle, that rhythm changed. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Mess decks fell quiet. In the gun turrets, crews checked and rechecked every lever and shell. Men wrote quick letters home, though most never said what they truly felt. They had trained for this moment for months, but no training could prepare them for the reality of what was coming. When the order finally came to load the guns, it felt surreal. In the cramped gun rooms, sailors worked in silence. The only sounds the metallic click of gears and the heavy clang of shell hoists. Outside, the deck crews braced themselves as distant flashes on the horizon marked the beginning of the bombardment. For some, it was pride. Missouri was the Navy's newest battleship, and her first combat action would be watched closely. For others, it was fear. The knowledge that the enemy could still strike back. Every man aboard understood the risk. Japanese shore batteries had sunk ships before. Kamikaze aircraft were always a threat. The moment those first guns fired, they were no longer anonymous sailors. They were combatants in history's largest naval war. The shock wave from the first salvo rolled through the decks, through the bones of every man aboard. In that instant, fear turned to adrenaline. The Missouri had spoken, and each man felt part of her voice. What followed was not chaos, but choreography. Disciplined, mechanical, relentless. The crew worked like a single machine, each man a cog in the great engine of war. Outside, the horizon burned. Inside, the smell of cordite and steel filled the air. The war that had once seemed distant was now real, alive, and deafening. And beyond the walls of the ship, far across the sea, others were watching. The commanders who had chosen where and when the Missouri would strike. The Missouri's debut in battle was not a coincidence. Admirals William F. Halsey and Raymond A. Spruance, two of the Pacific's most formidable commanders, understood that the final push toward Japan required every weapon in the arsenal. By 1945, aircraft carriers ruled the seas, but the battleship remained the embodiment of visible, immediate firepower. Halsey, known for his aggressive spirit, saw in the Missouri not just a warship, but a message. Her speed allowed her to operate alongside fast carrier task forces, while her guns could obliterate targets the bombers could not reach. She was a hybrid between past and future, a weapon of old-world might serving in the new age of naval aviation. Spruance, ever the strategist, valued precision and endurance. Under his command, battleships became the fleet's heavy fists, striking fortified shores before each amphibious assault. The bombardments at Iwo Jima and Okinawa were as much psychological warfare as physical destruction. Every explosion on shore was meant to break the will of Japanese defenders and shield American troops from the slaughter that inevitably followed. Missouri's role in these operations was critical. As flagship of Halsey's Third Fleet, she symbolized command authority itself, a moving headquarters where decisions shaping the fate of the Pacific were made. Her advanced communication systems allowed coordination of massive fleet actions, linking air wings, submarines, and surface groups across hundreds of miles. She was the nerve center of an empire of steel. From her decks, Halsey could see the culmination of everything the Navy had built since Pearl Harbor. A fleet that no longer feared the enemy, but dominated the seas completely. Missouri's bombardments were part of that doctrine, a demonstration that even in the age of aircraft, the thunder of battleship guns still had meaning. Yet on the other side of the ocean, within the battered empire of Japan, that thunder meant something very different. For Japanese soldiers stationed on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the arrival of the American Armada was like watching a storm swallow the horizon. From the cliffs and bunkers carved into volcanic rock, they could see battleships, dark silhouettes stretching across the sea. The sound of engines rolled like distant thunder. They knew what was coming. When the bombardments began, the earth itself seemed to dissolve. Massive 16-inch shells from ships like the Missouri tore through concrete and steel as if it were paper. Each impact sent shock waves through tunnels, collapsing fortifications and cutting off entire units. The defenders, huddled underground, endured bombardments that lasted hours, sometimes days. Some described the noise as continuous thunder. The sky flashing red and orange, the air thick with pulverized stone. Japanese commanders tried to adapt. At Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi ordered his men to remain underground and conserve their fire until the Americans landed. He knew the futility of firing back against such overwhelming naval power. The coastal batteries that did return fire were quickly silenced, their positions identified by American spotters and obliterated in minutes. For the Japanese Navy, the bombardments were an even deeper humiliation. Once proud battleships like Yamato and Musashi, symbols of imperial strength, had been lost to air attacks. Now Japan's coastlines were shelled by a new generation of American dreadnoughts. The sound of Missouri's guns carried not only destruction, but inevitability. And yet, within the wreckage and flame, there was a grim respect. Many Japanese soldiers, hardened by years of combat, recognized the precision and discipline of the enemy bombardment. They understood they were facing a war machine far beyond their industrial capacity, a nation that had mastered war through science and production. The bombardments of 1945 were not merely acts of destruction, they were demonstrations of dominance. The Missouri's firepower symbolized the end of Japan's empire, the thunder of inevitability rolling toward its shores. As smoke drifted over the horizon and the guns fell silent, the Missouri had proven her purpose. Her technology, her tactics, and her men had worked as one. But the war was not over yet. Ahead lay Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, and there, the Missouri would face not just the enemy's fortifications, but its most desperate weapon, the kamikaze. The order came at dawn on February 16th, 1945. The USS Missouri, anchored among the vast fleet of Task Force 58, was about to enter her first battle. The target, Iwo Jima, lay just ahead, a speck of volcanic rock rising from the Grey Pacific. For weeks, aerial reconnaissance had shown the island's labyrinth of tunnels, artillery positions, and reinforced bunkers. The mission was simple in theory, but monumental in execution. Reduce the island's defenses before the Marines stormed ashore. From the bridge, Captain William M. Callahan gave the signal to commence bombardment. On the horizon, dozens of ships opened fire almost simultaneously, their muzzle flashes turning the sea into a flickering wall of flame. The Missouri's forward turrets elevated slowly, locking onto pre-designated targets spotted by aircraft circling overhead. Then, fire. The first salvo shattered the morning stillness. The roar of the Missouri's 16-inch guns rolled like thunder over the water, followed seconds later by distant eruptions on Iwo Jima. The shells, each weighing nearly a ton and traveling at over 1,800 feet per second, struck with unimaginable force. Bunkers collapsed, cliffs disintegrated, and black plumes of volcanic ash shot skyward. The entire ship quivered from the recoil, but her gunners were already loading the next rounds. Inside the turrets, amid the heat and echo, the crews worked in rhythm. Powder bags lifted, shells rammed home, breach closed, fire. The sound became a steady heartbeat of destruction. Above the chaos, spotter planes relayed corrections through radio bursts. Left 200, fire for effect. Each adjustment brought the rounds closer to their targets. Within minutes, entire defensive zones were obliterated. The Missouri's radar-assisted fire control system allowed her to bombard targets even through the thick haze of smoke and ash. Precision had replaced guesswork. This was war by calculation. For the Marines watching from their transports, it was a sight of both reassurance and awe. The battleship's shells tore open the island like the hands of a god. Craters 40 feet wide pocked the black sand. The Japanese defenders, hidden deep within their tunnels, could only wait. Their communications shattered, their supply caches destroyed. And yet, as the bombardment continued, a grim reality emerged. Despite days of relentless shelling, much of Iwo Jima's underground defense network remained intact. The Japanese had transformed the island into a fortress of rock, concrete, and determination. They endured, hidden beneath layers of stone that even the Missouri's shells could barely penetrate. Still, the effect of the bombardment was decisive. It neutralized key artillery positions, destroyed coastal guns, and softened enemy defenses enough for the invasion to proceed. When the Marines landed on February 19th, they were met with ferocious resistance. But without the Missouri's and her sister ships' bombardments, the losses would have been catastrophic. Throughout the battle, the Missouri continued her fire missions, supporting ground troops through constant coordination with spotter aircraft. Each request for fire was treated with precision. Target coordinates, elevation, shell type, time on target. The gunnery officers calculated trajectories in seconds, turning raw data into death from afar. The noise was endless. Day and night the battleship's guns thundered. The sea surface shimmered from the concussion waves. Crewmen rotated in shifts, their faces blackened by smoke, their ears ringing from the constant barrage. The air hung heavy with cordite and salt. By the time Iwo Jima fell, the Missouri had fired hundreds of shells. Her decks were scarred, her barrels worn, but her reputation was born. The ship had proven her worth beyond question. Her firepower had shaped the battlefield. Her precision had saved lives, and her name had become known across the fleet. But as one battle ended, another, far greater and bloodier, loomed on the horizon. To the north, the island of Okinawa awaited, the final stepping stone to Japan itself. And there, the Missouri would face not just the enemy's guns, but its very soul, the kamikaze, April 1945. The USS Missouri steamed toward Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The fleet that surrounded her was colossal, more than 1,400 ships, carrying 500,000 men. The mission was clear: capture Okinawa, the last barrier before Japan's home islands. But the defenders knew what was at stake. The Japanese had transformed the island into a fortress and unleashed their most desperate weapon, the kamikaze. In the days before the landings, the Missouri joined the preliminary bombardments. Her guns fired day after day, carving trenches across the island's ridges, blasting supply depots and reducing enemy batteries to rubble. The sky trembled with the sound of naval gunfire and the ceaseless whine of carrier-based aircraft. Yet even as the shells rained down, danger came from above. On April 11th, the radar picked up incoming bogies. Seconds later, Japanese aircraft appeared low over the horizon, kamikazes diving through clouds of flak. Gun crews manned their anti-aircraft batteries, filling the sky with bursts of steel. Dozens of enemy planes fell in flames, but one broke through. A single Mitsubishi Zero plunged toward the Missouri, its engine screaming. The ship's 40mm guns roared, but the pilot held his course. The aircraft struck the battleship's starboard side, just below the main deck. Flames erupted. Debris scattered across the superstructure. The explosion shook the ship, but the armor held. The fire was contained within minutes. When the smoke cleared, the crew found the remains of the pilot, his body thrown across the deck. In an act that would be remembered for generations, Captain Callahan ordered a full military burial for the fallen enemy aviator. The Japanese pilot was given honors equal to those of any American sailor. His remains committed to the sea with dignity. The gesture stunned the crew. It spoke of something deeper than victory or vengeance. It was a reminder that even in war's cruelty, humanity could still endure. But the battle raged on. For nearly 3 months, the Missouri remained off Okinawa, providing relentless gunfire support to Marines and soldiers ashore. Her guns pounded enemy positions with mechanical regularity, often firing around the clock. Every shell was a calculated strike, every explosion part of a relentless symphony of destruction. The toll was immense. Over 100,000 Japanese defenders were killed. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the crossfire. The cost for the Allies was staggering, nearly 12,000 Americans dead, many more wounded. Yet through it all, the Missouri remained unyielding, her crew exhausted but resolute. When the guns finally fell silent in June 1945, the island lay in ruins. The U.S. Navy had secured its final base for the coming invasion of Japan, but events were about to take a dramatic turn. The Missouri, now seasoned and battle-tested, was reassigned as flagship of Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. From her bridge, the Admiral directed final operations against the Japanese homeland, launching airstrikes and bombardments that brought Japan's war industry to collapse. Yet even as she prepared for one last campaign, something unimaginable occurred: the detonation of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Suddenly, the war that had forged the Missouri in fire was ending. Japan signaled its intent to surrender. The Missouri's journey, from her first shells at Iwo Jima to her final bombardments at Okinawa, had mirrored the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. She had embodied its fury, its precision, and its moral weight, and soon she would serve not as an instrument of destruction, but as the stage for peace. Her decks, once thunderous with war, would host the surrender of an empire. The thunder of her guns had silenced Japan's defenses. Now, the silence itself would speak louder than any shell ever fired. When the guns finally fell silent at Okinawa in June 1945, the USS Missouri floated in calm waters that belied the fury she had unleashed. Her 16-inch guns, blackened with soot and salt, had spent months pounding enemy fortifications into submission. The thunder that once rolled across the Pacific now faded into memory, replaced by the low hum of victory. But victory came with a cost written in blood, steel, and ash. Operational reports told the story with cold precision. Between Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Missouri had fired over 1,000 16-inch shells and tens of thousands of smaller rounds. Her bombardments had neutralized dozens of coastal guns, destroyed fortified caves, and shattered supply depots hidden in cliffs. At Iwo Jima alone, U.S. naval gunfire had reduced enemy resistance by half before the first Marine boot touched the sand. At Okinawa, she had played a central role in flattening the Shuri Line, the backbone of Japanese defense, allowing ground forces to push inland. The material toll on Japan was staggering. Entire divisions were cut off, their supply lines pulverized. Enemy morale broke under the relentless shelling. Soldiers who once vowed to die for the emperor now fought in isolation, cut off from orders or hope. Civilians, too, witnessed the might of American naval artillery and saw the end approaching. From Tokyo's propagandists to the last garrisons of the Ryukyus, the message was clear. The sea itself had turned against Japan. The psychological impact of the Missouri's bombardments was profound. Survivors of the Okinawa campaign later recounted the terror of the floating volcano, as Japanese troops nicknamed her, whose shells fell with such force that the very earth seemed to convulse. A single salvo could erase entire defensive sectors. The precision, rhythm, and endurance of her fire missions turned destruction into an art form, executed with mechanical discipline. Within the U.S. fleet, Missouri's name began to circulate as a symbol of power and dependability. She had arrived late to the war, but her impact was immediate. Among the sailors, she earned affectionate nicknames, the Mighty Mo, the Big Mo, titles that spoke of both her stature and spirit. Her gunners joked that she could level a mountain before breakfast, and her deck crews took pride in the perfection of their drills. Her combat performance was matched by her resilience. Despite near-constant exposure to enemy aircraft and shore batteries, Missouri sustained only minor damage. The kamikaze strike at Okinawa had tested her armor and her crew's discipline, and both had held firm. The burial of the Japanese pilot had further elevated the ship's standing, transforming her from a mere instrument of war into a vessel of moral contrast, capable of immense destruction, yet guided by decency. For Admiral Halsey, Missouri became more than just another flagship. She was the embodiment of the modern American battleship, an apex of naval engineering and strategic power. Her role in coordinating air, sea, and ground fire support at Okinawa had demonstrated that battleships still held relevance in the age of aircraft carriers. The fusion of radar, fire control, and human precision aboard her decks represented the pinnacle of Allied naval warfare. By July 1945, Japan's naval power was annihilated, its merchant shipping in ruins. The remaining airfields lay silent beneath the blackened soil. Yet even as her enemies fell, Missouri's crew knew the war's end would demand one final act, not of violence, but of ceremony. The ship's growing reputation reached Washington. When discussions began about where Japan's official surrender should take place, Missouri's name surfaced almost immediately. She was new, battle-tested, and symbolically perfect. Commissioned by a nation that had endured Pearl Harbor, fought its way across the Pacific, and now stood on the brink of peace. There was another reason. Too, she carried the name of President Harry S. Truman's home state. The connection was intimate and unmistakable. The president himself approved the choice with quiet pride. The Missouri had earned her place in history through fire. Now she would help end history's most devastating war. As August 1945 approached, the Pacific quieted. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki obliterated the last illusions of Japanese resistance. The empire sent its envoys to negotiate surrender. And while the fleets of the world awaited the moment, one battleship, sleek, scarred, and solemn, prepared to host the dawn of a new age. The Missouri's decks were cleaned, her brass polished, her crew standing ready. For the first time, her guns were silent by design, not exhaustion. The ship that had symbolized war's might was about to become its closing chapter. On the morning of September 2, 1945, The USS Missouri lay anchored in Tokyo Bay, beneath a calm, clouded sky. Around her, an armada of Allied ships stood silent, steel sentinels witnessing the end of an era. The sea was still, as if holding its breath. Aboard the Missouri, preparations for the ceremony had been completed with precision worthy of her battle drills. Every line was coiled, every deck scrubbed until it gleamed. At 8:56 a.m., the Japanese delegation came aboard, dressed in somber black, their faces pale with exhaustion and humiliation. They were led across the quarterdeck to a plain wooden table set beneath the barrels of Missouri's forward guns. Those massive turrets, once aimed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, now loomed silently overhead, mute witnesses to the transformation of power into peace. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, stood tall before them. His tone was calm, his words deliberate. "We are gathered here," he declared, "to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." The moment carried the weight of the entire war. On that table lay two simple documents, one for Japan, one for the Allies. As Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu stepped forward to sign, his hand trembled slightly. Beside him, General Yoshijiro Umezu bowed deeply before putting pen to paper. The ink flowed, the signatures dried, and the war that had engulfed the world for 6 years was officially over. MacArthur then signed for the Allies, followed by representatives from China, the Soviet Union, Britain, and other nations. When it came time for the United States, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz signed in his quiet, steady hand. The last signature was made by General Sir Thomas Blamey of Australia. With each name added, the moment became more than an end. It became a testament. Above them, the crew of the Missouri stood at attention on her superstructure, watching in reverent silence. Many had fought in the ship's bombardments, manned her guns, and tended her fires. Now they watched the same decks become a bridge between war and peace. The transformation was not lost on them. Outside the bay, Allied planes flew in formation, filling the sky with the sound of engines, a salute not of destruction, but of triumph. Below, the American flag that had flown over Pearl Harbor in 1941 was raised over the Missouri. Its fabric, worn but unbowed, fluttered gently in the breeze. In that instant, the ship that had thundered across the Pacific became the world's stage for reconciliation. The Missouri had journeyed from the chaos of Iwo Jima to the solemnity of Tokyo Bay, from the deafening roar of guns to the soft scratch of pen on paper. Her steel hull had carried both the fury and the forgiveness of a nation. For her crew, it was the culmination of everything they had endured. The long nights at battle stations, the smoke and heat of her guns, the loss of comrades, all led to this silent triumph. The mighty Mo had fulfilled her purpose not just as a weapon of war, but as an instrument of history. In the years that followed, the Missouri would serve in Korea, Vietnam, and even the Persian Gulf. But no moment would ever equal that September morning in Tokyo Bay. Her name became synonymous with both might and mercy, destruction and diplomacy. Her first act of war had been to shatter the shores of Iwo Jima. Her final act of peace was to host the surrender that ended it all. And as the flag rippled above her, sunlight breaking through the clouds, the Missouri stood not just as a battleship, but as a monument to the paradox of victory, that the instruments of destruction can, in their final hour, become vessels of peace. In the still waters of Tokyo Bay, the USS Missouri became more than a warship. She became a mirror, reflecting the entire arc of the Second World War. From the thunder of her 16-inch guns to the quiet scratch of pens signing peace, her story encapsulated the transformation of human power itself, from destruction to restraint, from fury to reflection. The Missouri represented the pinnacle of industrial warfare, the might of nations forged into steel. Her engines were the heartbeat of a generation that believed in progress through dominance. And by the time the war ended, her towering guns symbolized not just power, but the limits of it. The same machine that once delivered annihilation now stood silent beneath flags of truce. Its strength rendered meaningful only when turned toward peace. In that silence lay a lesson. Technology, however perfect, carries the weight of the hands that wield it. The Missouri's fire had torn through islands and strongholds, but it was the discipline and conscience of her crew that gave her legacy dignity. They had seen what human brilliance could build, and what human rage could destroy. When the surrender was signed beneath her guns, it marked not only Japan's defeat, but the end of an age. Battleships like the Missouri would never again decide the fate of empires. The world was moving toward a colder, faster, nuclear reality, where wars would be fought with fear and deterrence, not armor and shellfire. Yet even in obsolescence, the mighty Mo endures. Preserved today as a museum ship in Pearl Harbor, she stands near the resting place of the USS Arizona, the beginning and the end of America's Pacific War bound in a single harbor. Visitors walk her decks and touch the steel that once roared across oceans, sensing both the power and humility of history. In the end, the Missouri reminds us that peace is not born from the absence of strength, but from its understanding. She began as thunder from the sea. She rests now as a silent witness to the truth every generation must learn, that the greatest victories are the ones that end the guns.